minutes, we'll talk about different practical tips and different approaches to conducting good literature reviews. Maybe you have encountered this situation when you started research based on some theories and some papers, and you've included them in your background and you based your study on them, but then after you finished it, you accidentally discover that there is a paper you missed in your literature search, or maybe someone has done exactly the same thing that you have. Oh, facepalm. Unfortunately, it happens in science. Maybe it has happened to all of us. But in order to prevent this from happening, do what I say, not what I do. Conduct really good theoretical reviews. Because what you want to do is to avoid inventing the bicycle. You want to conduct a study that is interesting and is up to date. In Russian papers, we have seen some papers by people who probably just don't read in English. And sometimes they publish studies where they test hypotheses that were relevant in the 1960s using methods that were relevant in 1930s, like a correlation between MMPI and Kettle's test. But come on, it's enough just to open Google Scholar and you will find 10 papers investigating this exact correlation. It makes no sense to invent the bicycle. Also, your literature review is needed to help you look at strong and weak points of different ways to formulate your problem and of different empirical approaches to measuring, to studying, to designing your study. Because there are many pitfalls into which previous researchers have already fallen. Let's not repeat their destiny. Let's conduct studies based on the errors that other people have already made. And of course, whenever we plan a study, we need to generalize all the existing accumulated knowledge in psychology. This way we can arrive at what is really important today, or what's going to be important tomorrow, perhaps. There are two different types of theoretical reviews. In an empirical study, you always start with a theoretical review which you place in your introduction section or your theoretical background chapter of your paper. And this theoretical review is typically more concise. It doesn't have to be completely comprehensive. Its purpose is just to justify the study by answering the questions, what it is that you're trying to study, how it can be defined, why is it necessary, has anyone done it, why did you choose this particular experimental paradigm? And from this theoretical review, which reviews different approaches and different theories, from this review, it should follow that the way you are conducting your study is really relevant nowadays, is important, and will advance science. But of course, there is also theoretical review as a special type of work when people do a completely theoretical work in order to focus on a certain problem that is stated and studied in science, or in order to generalize over existing studies and get an idea about next steps, or to reveal contradictions and blind spots in the literature. And this type of reviews you can typically find in special dedicated journals like annual reviews in psychology, or maybe theory and psychology, or whatever it is in your field in social psychology. I'm not sure. There definitely are also some review journals. And if you find such a paper for your topic, make sure you don't miss it, because other people have already done the bulk of the work for you, and you can just refer to their work, to their conclusions, and to add to their work instead of repeating it. But when you face a theoretical paper, or a paper that is proposing a new theory, sometimes there are really good papers that are really meaningful and relevant, but very often there are also some strange papers where people have written a lot of words, but what it is that they are actually trying to say, it's not clear. It's completely vague, it's completely strange, because the criteria for theories, criteria of quality, are not as simple and not as straightforward as criteria for empirical studies. For empirical studies, you can always say, okay, sample is small, okay, this method is not so good for this research question. But for theories, so if you encounter a theory, a theoretical paper, first of all, ask a question, what is its original substantive contribution? think about scientific search in a field as a path that we are exploring, and the author is like Ivan Susanin trying to guide us on this path. So what he or she is telling us, maybe the field is in the right place, or we need to make a step forward, or we need to come back to somewhere where we were in the past and restart. But some kind of message should be there. And if you encounter a theory, it's important to think of different criteria that differentiate a good theory from a bad one. Is it clear? Is it related to the past work? Or maybe the author only cites Heidegger and himself? Then it's probably not such a good paper. Is it possible to falsify it? Are there any empirical predictions that you can actually test? Or maybe this theory is so abstract that there is no way to actually falsify it. There is no way to conduct a study that could actually disprove it. Then it's not a good theory. Karl Popper would say it's not a scientific theory at all. Is this theory generalizable? Does it apply to other cultures? In social psychology, we often find theories that are informed by American culture, but it's not clear whether they work in other cultural contexts or in other situations. Does the author reflect on the limitations of their theory? Does he introduce the boundaries in which this explanation works? Is it logically coherent? Does it fit with past data? Or does it predict future data, like a periodic table of chemical elements, which predicted chemical elements that did not exist or were not known to people at the time periodic table was created? But it was a great piece of theory because it predicted those future findings. And finally, the theory needs to be simple. It's easy to create a very complex theory that will confuse everyone. But unless it's simple, no one is going to really use it. And maybe it's not a good theory if it's not simple enough to be easily grasped. And finally, is it exciting? Or is it boring? A good theory needs to be exciting, needs to be interesting. So you can apply these criteria when you review theoretical papers or when you try to decide whether I should really read this paper or maybe it's some kind of nonsense that I should just put on the shelf or put in my reference list and never go through it properly. Our next step is to talk about more practical, more specific steps that we take when we conduct theoretical reviews, when we write this coursework this year. What makes a good review? First of all, a good review has a reasonably wide scope, but it's not too wide. If you have included in your reference list 300 different literature sources, there is absolutely no way you can manage to analyze them. Sorry, my screen was trying to turn off. If you have too many sources, there is no way you can engage with them properly. And you will just mention them, but it makes no sense to have too many. But then again, you may have too few sources and go too much in depth analyzing each source. But unless your problem is very narrow and unless your field is very small, this approach might not be an optimal one. The third criterion is that your sources should be relevant. They should be relevant to your problem. Obviously, it's easy to stick in your reference list whatever, but it makes no sense. Your interpretations need to be careful. And this is the problem we encounter when we rely too much on secondary sources. We open a textbook written by some author, Pupkin or Johnson, who is describing the theory of Sigmund Freud. But there is no guarantee that Pupkin or Johnson has a really good understanding of the theory of Sigmund Freud. So it would be better to present Freudian theory based on Freud if you have the time, or make sure that the author Pupkin is really a specialist in Freudian theory. Also, a good review includes some critical analysis of your sources. There are normally two parts. There is a part where we describe what has been done, and there is a part where we reflect on it. When we compare different approaches, or we generalize, or we think about next steps. And this is basically your critical analysis, the most important part of your literature review. When you reflect critically, you discover weak and strong points, you discover connections and contradictions. This is what is important about your review. Because just describe past work, anyone can do it. You don't even need to write anything, just use Google. And a good review makes some conclusions that inform future empirical studies. A good review is also effective. It's not too long. It's fairly easy to write very long papers. It's much harder to write short but very information intensive and really useful papers. People don't like reading long texts anymore. Unfortunately, in the 21st century, we have no time. So we need to write really concise and to-the-point reviews. And finally, a good review is logically structured. It has different parts that are connected in some way, and it should be clear from the structure of the work how these parts are connected. What kind of approaches can be used to structure our reviews? Well, there are different ways out of a student's cookbook. One approach is you can rely on theoretical logic. You might want to start with general points of a theory you're interested in, and then proceed to more specific models, to specific empirical studies based on this theory. And then based on the review of the studies, you might discover that here is something that needs to be researched, or here is a contradiction that needs to be resolved. The second recipe is historical logic, and this one is probably the easiest. You start with Plato, and your first chapter describes philosophical models of something, whatever it is that you're interested in. Then the second chapter describes psychological models, and here you start with Wundt, and you follow until you reach your supervisor. And based on this historical analysis, you might arrive at some trends and at some contradictions or perspectives. The third approach is to use the logic of phenomena. You are interested in anxiety during tests in mathematics. So your chapter 1 might be about anxiety or anxiety at school. Chapter 2 might be about mathematics and why it is so stressful for school children. And chapter 3 might actually focus on the connection between the two problems and some kind of existing models of test anxiety specifically applied to mathematics. And this way you arrive at your research problem. And finally, the fourth recipe, that there is no recipe. As Nancy Eisenberg says in her chapter, which I include in the literature, because it has some tips on writing reviews, there is no right way to structure a literature review. Basically, it's a creative process. Whatever works for you is good. However, there are also some pitfalls. The pitfalls that await us when we write our reviews. The minor problem is when we ignore some sources, and this happens very often. No matter what your topic, it's very likely that in the committee that reviews your master's thesis, there will be some person who will say, I researched this topic in 1960s in Soviet Union. Why did not you dig up my publication? And the only way to answer this is to say, oh, thank you so much for this important consideration. We will do our best to incorporate this work in our future reviews when we publish this work. But obviously, you need to acknowledge the fact that it's impossible to review absolutely everything. So unless this source is really, really relevant, is really a key one for understanding the problem, it's not a big deal that you missed it. But of course, the person who is sitting in the master's committee might have a different view with respect to how important that paper is. The second problem is more serious. Misinterpretation. When you describe Freudian theory based on Pupkin's textbook, and you might actually describe some ideas in the wrong way. But this happens, unfortunately. But we need to try and avoid it. This is why we ask you to try and use primary sources, try and look up primary references if you have time and if you can access them. The two other problems are not so common for scientific reviews, but they are common for some papers that you can find on websites, for example. When people quote only the results that are in line with their hypothesis or with their views, and when people misrepresent some existing facts, you can often encounter some texts like why vaccines are good for you or why vaccines are bad for you, when people only review on the evidence that supports their point of view. This is not scientific at all. We need to avoid these insights by all costs, and reviewers definitely will remind us that there are also other perspectives on the problem that we did not acknowledge. And then there comes a part where you actually start writing. Writing your review may be a long process. You may need to rewrite and do several drafts. So don't be afraid of rewriting. It's totally fine. However, one thing that we need to be aware about when we write is plagiarism. Every decent university has a certain policy on plagiarism, because plagiarism is something that we want completely to avoid in science. At the Higher School of Economics, there is also a policy on plagiarism, which states that if a person submits a work where some sufficiently large fragments are plagiarized, this work receives an evaluation of 0, and if it happens for the second time, this person is dismissed from the university. So in order to avoid this, we need to be very clear in our understanding of what plagiarism is. Plagiarism is when in our own work we use other people's results, other people's ideas, or other people's fragments of texts without referencing a source. So as a result, there is appropriation. When a person reads your text, they cannot tell which part is your original work and which part comes from another person's work. And the problem is that plagiarism can sometimes be unintentional. Imagine that a student is writing a review and they have written a text, but they thought, I will put references later on. But it may happen that the submission deadline is already close and there is no time to put in references anymore. As a result, it is very easy to conduct unintentional plagiarism just because there are no references. So we need to avoid this. And there is also obviously self-plagiarism, when a person publishes the same text or pretty much the same results based on the same data in two different papers. American Psychological Association defines double publication very clearly. If your results were published in an open in a source which is accessible to unlimited audience, it has been published. You cannot republish it anymore. But obviously, if you publish some kind of conference abstract, it's fine to then publish a full-sized research paper based on this. But if you have two papers with the same results, even if they are in different languages, it's a very bad idea, because even in different languages, these papers will be seen on Scopus together, and readers will think that there are two independent studies, when in fact it's a single study. That's why this is considered as a violation of academic integrity. And plagiarism, of course, entails some sanctions. A software that is used to detect plagiarism around the world is called Turnitin, and on their website you can find some examples of plagiarized works. Sometimes when people just copy and paste, it's clear plagiarism, but sometimes when people rely very closely on original sources, they don't really formulate in their own words. This is somewhere on the verge of plagiarism. Some people might consider it plagiarism, some people may not. So it depends. One important point is that we use all kinds of software to detect plagiarism, and this software gives us percentage of original text, so-called. But it's important to know that this percentage does not say anything about the quality of your work, and it does not say anything about the fact of plagiarism, because software cannot distinguish legitimate citations and plagiarism. Software can only tell whether there is a text that overlaps with other sources. But in order to tell between plagiarized and non-plagiarized work, we need an expert who will actually read it. And this is how Russian community Dissernet works, which tries to find out stolen dissertations when people take someone else's dissertation and defend it as their own. So thanks to Dissernet, this problem of plagiarism has been gradually reduced almost to non-existence in Russia. So nowadays, everyone is aware that if they steal someone else's dissertation, they will not be able to defend it anymore, unlike 10 years ago. So if your percentage of original text is not very high, it doesn't mean there is a problem. I once had a student whose percentage of original text was like 46%, I think, but she wrote a very large master's thesis, and she analyzed a lot of original sources, and she relied very closely on original citations because she wanted to be very careful in her analysis. And I think she got a 10 because her work was really relevant and all the references were in place. So even if your percentage of original text is below 80, it does not mean there is definitely a problem. As long as you are sure that you have properly acknowledged all the other people's work in your work. How can we decide what should we acknowledge or what is common knowledge? American Psychological Association says that if this knowledge is part of secondary school course, you don't need to provide a reference. The Earth is rotating around the Sun. You don't need to refer to Galileo. It's common knowledge. But if it's not part of a secondary school course, it's a good idea to introduce a reference to support your point of view and to refer to another person's idea. To avoid self-plagiarism, make sure you're allowed to reuse fragments of your old work in your new work. For example, when you write your master's thesis, you are totally free to reuse fragments of your coursework that you're going to write during your first year, because your coursework and your master's thesis are considered as two different steps within the same research project, of which master's thesis is just a final report. But when you publish a paper and you include, for example, 3 studies, one of which has already been published, at least you need to include a reference and say that this was already published there, and you need to make an editor aware of this fact. You may mention it in your cover letter or just include a reference in your paper so that it would be clear that this part was already published. And if an editor says, please exclude this part, you need to do it. And finally, when you write your text, you need to use correct citation formats to acknowledge the authorship of other people. If you use a text fragment, you copy and paste it in your work, include it in quotations and include a reference to the source, ideally with a page, unless it's an electronic source where pages are absent. Sometimes you might want to use paraphrase, but then if you use paraphrase, you need to rephrase the words. You need to present it in your own words rather than copy and paste. Otherwise, it will be potentially a plagiarism. And of course, you can refer to sources without quoting. And you can mention names of several authors. But if you mention too many, these might not look very good in your text. Perhaps it makes sense to comment a little bit, at least on these sources. What kind of reference formats can you use? We recommend American Psychological Association reference formats because it's the most common in psychological science around the world, not only in the States, but also in most other countries. In Russia, there is also the Russian standard GOST. If you use it, try not to reference by number, because it will be a huge pain for you and your work will be very inconvenient to read. Every time to find out what you're referring to, I need to look at the literature at the end. So use the last name and year format, which is also proposed by GOST. It's a much better option. But by default, for your master's thesis, we invite you to use American Psychological Association format. And there are many online tutorials that present different styles of references, of different types of references based on the APA style. You can find many such references, example, online. And I will not even go into that. A good life hack that is important. Often when we do literature searches, we use Google Scholar. It's possible to make Google Scholar produce references in the APA style. When you find something with Google Scholar, which is basically a type of Google that indexes only the sources that it considers to be scientific publications, so I totally recommend you to use Google Scholar, but not regular Google for your literature search. And when you find something with Google Scholar, there is this little inverted comma icon below each reference, and if you click on it, you will see the reference in APA style, which you can just copy and paste in your work. Sometimes, even for the papers I already have, and I know, and I have found before, I use this search just to get this reference much more quickly than I would create it by hand. But of course, if you are more technically skilled, you might want to use a reference manager. There is a commercial reference manager, EndNote, and there are free reference managers such as Mendeley and Zotero. These are pieces of software that store PDFs of your papers and references to these papers for you. So you can easily download PDFs and include references in the base directly from a browser page when you have Google Scholar or Scopus open on your screen. And then it's very easy to insert citations in Word, and you can create a reference list automatically after you have inserted all citations. So it saves a lot of time. And especially it saves a lot of time when you have different journals that require different formats. And if a journal with an APA style rejects your paper and you need to submit it to a journal with GHOST style, I spent a whole day reformatting references in my paper. So don't do what I do. Do what I say. Maybe you will feel comfortable using reference managers. For some reason, they don't really work for me. What are